We're here today on this beautiful October afternoon at the old Willow River Cemetery in Hudson, Wisconsin. I have with me Willis Miller, publisher emeritus of the Hudson paper, and my name is Richard Larsen. I'm an old resident here, moved up here from Madison just recently to do this special team. We're standing at the grave of Susie Elizabeth Webb and her young sister Hattie and that other sister, I think, Frances. And Willis, would you like to tell us about this, or tell us about this stone?
Well, the stone, of course, is one of the most colorful ones in the cemetery. It has this very old saying on, "Remember me as you pass by, as you are, so none once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Prepare for death and follow me." It's a saying that was placed on many tombstones of this era in the 1860s, and these three children have this honor of that beautiful stone.
Doesn't that look like Gothic, sort of a Gothic?
It is.
Really dark, and it's beautiful,
Yeah.
and it's been around since
Yes.
1870 or 1880. So
Yeah,
really
1880.
beautiful. This is what's left of a veteran of the War of 1812. His name was Vincent Streeter. Willis, can you talk about that?
Well, back in the World War II, I was up here and I documented all the tombstones. And that means I wrote down the entire cemetery here. At the time I was here, Vincent Streeter's tombstone was here. But since then it has been vandalized. It is not here. However, Vincent Streeter, I think, is one of two veterans of the War of 1812 that is buried here. The stone is gone, but his memory still lingers. Streeter was a very old name in our town, dating back, of course, to the Civil War days.
Well, this is what happens to these old cemeteries. I know there was a lot of problem in Eau Claire. There's vandalism.
Quite recently, yes.
There's vandalism. I'm not sure what the target is or why. It seems such a benign thing to deal with, but I think that I've often thought that these places have so much historical significance, and they're so important to our community. If strangely, as a financial asset,
Yeah.
hundreds of people tour these things every year,
right.
and they all shop at our town and buy things at the restaurant and stop in the newspaper. And I was kind of hoping one of the clubs or one of the groups would start thinking about ways to raise money for the repair. This is not cheap to repair these, but there are ways to do this, to use the old stones and as best as possible and put them back and try somehow to educate our youngsters, and I think it's youngsters, not to damage these. It's so simple to do it. I guess I can kick over most of these myself, but it seems so counterproductive. So I guess that's the only preaching I'm going to do this afternoon.
At the time that I did the documentation here, I got all the stones. And today, I suppose that 25% of those are gone since that was done. Of course, that was 50 years ago, nearly. So, yeah.
But I think you'll find it's more than that.
I'm
I
sure.
look at holes in this place.
Yes.
There are places that I know there were graves in my lifetime that are
Yes.
missing now. Well, do you want to walk over here and I'd like to show you the last Civil War veteran's grave.
All right.
And I'd like to see a few other things over here. And you tell me where you want to go.
Right down there.
This way?
That's
Okay.
the early part of the cemetery.
The early part. One of our oldest lawyers in town was William Semmes, and this stone was destroyed about 10 years ago now. He was a relative, close relative of the Semmes family who were involved in the Civil War on the Confederate side. He was an attorney here and in Stillwater, and he died, I think, of cholera, as did quite a few more in 1854. He was a very young man. And going through some of the Semmes genealogy, this guy was a missing link in some of their family. I don't have it with me. I do have some information on him, but he was the one guy they knew went west and never knew what happened to him. So we fill in a space. He never married. He was a young man. And he was with 3 or 4 other attorneys who were here, all became judges.
I think he was about one of the very first.
Yes, yes.
As I recall, I think his birth or his death date was 1858.
54, wasn't it?
Was it? Well, was it 54?
What does it say on there? Well, screw up this 1854, September
Oh, it is, yeah.
13th. He died the same time as some of the Simmons children
yes.
died.
Think of that, yeah.
The same problem. We always kind of laughed at the newspaper accounts of that day. It showed Mr. Semmes. It showed the Simmons boys who died, and the 4 or 5 other English families. And then at the end of the account, it says, and there were 4 Norwegian children died too.
Yeah,
They never named them. They
No
just said
name.
4 children, 4 Norwegians died.
yeah.
So that's kind of the story of William Semmes. But he's a very fascinating character, a very bright man, a good writer. He wrote for some of the newspaper accounts of the day, and sadly missed and missed completely by some of his family people in Virginia.
This is the site of the first burial in this lot. This is Amma Andrews, who was one of the early comers. He came in the days of the territory. His wife died soon after, and she was buried here in 1850, and that was the first burial, and it's right on this site. The stone, of course, was extant till I think it was here 10 years ago, but since then the Vandals got it and it's disappeared.
They were the people that gave the land, weren't they, Willis?
They gave the land.
To
It was Amma.
Amma.
He had a twin brother called what's it?
Amos? No.
Amos. Yeah.
Close to. We'll find
Amma,
out.
yeah.
We'll find
I
out.
can't remember that. Yeah. But this is where it started.
And it's a wonderful view of the St. Croix just over the hill, and right along the top of this hill and up the path from where the funeral cortege took place, cutting through the trees. And,
Yeah.
it's a wonderful spot.
This is the vault of William H. Kroll, an early entrepreneur in Hudson. He died in 1880, and this vault was built. And I understand the vault cost either $1,000 or $1,500 at the time. There were 6 places for burial inside. When I was a youngster, we used to come up here and you could get in. There was a grill on the door, and you went in, and you were always frightened. It was dark and damp in there, but it was boarded up, I think, maybe 10 or 12 years, maybe 15 years ago, because vandals were getting into it. However, it was opened again by a friend of mine, and they came up here to look, and they broke into the vault, and they saw that there was only 2 burials in there, and they left. That was it.
Yeah.
That was your friend.
Yes.
Yeah. And Mr. Kroll was the man that built the Opera House down in Hudson.
Where was that?
It's the old Opera House building right on 2nd Street, right across from the Dibble Hotel.
Okay.
The German restaurant is located in the
basement.
In the basement. Mr. Kroll.
Mr. Crow's still gone, though, right?
Yes, Mr. Kroll is still gone. Yeah.
But this is what's left. It was a beautiful spot when I was a kid, but it's certainly weathered poorly, and again, the vandalism has not done any good.
It's
really
bad business.
Bad. It's too bad, but it's the way it's going to be more than likely.
Yeah.
Anton Swanson is Hudson's last Civil War veteran, and Willis and I remember him. I remember him as I was just a little boy. My mother pointing him out to me, and I spent a long time trying to figure out what he was a veteran of, because he didn't show up on the Minnesota records.
That's right.
Until this spring, I had a copy of the records of the 3rd Minnesota Light Battery Artillery, and here was all the Swansons listed in a nice row. At the bottom of it, it says Anton Swanton.
Misspelling.
Misspelled. So we never knew that he belonged there, but he was a great character who came here, one of the Norwegians who came here in 1854, lived his whole life in Hudson, was part of this group, enlisted in 1864, was part of the terrible march back from the Dakotas in winter of 64-65, did not face the enemy. They were primarily there to do Indian or Native American protection, if that's what you can call it. But every inch a veteran, and he died here in 1937 or 8. 1941, excuse me.
Yes.
He had to be, because I wouldn't have remembered it before.
That's right.
And he was just a whimsy little guy. Any stories you want to tell about him?
Well, anyway, he always appeared, of course, at the annual Memorial Day services, which were generally held at the Armory down on 2nd Street in those days. And I remember him, of course, as a very old, wiggly, tottery old man, but he always was in the parades, in a car and waving to people and all. He was very animated. He was a nice old fellow. Yep.
But this grave is not marked, and with a Civil War emblem in it.
Why is that, I wonder?
I don't know, but we'll change it this year.
Yeah, that's right.
It's the only one we remember. You know?
Yeah, that's right.
I guess Lloyd Garrison, whatever his name is back there. We remember him, but green. But otherwise, and that's his wife next door is Cordelia. And the family moved to. His mother and dad moved to Clear Lake.
Clear Lake.
I lost track of them, so
we'll
find them next year.
Right.
But that's it. That's just. I thought you should remember that where this grave is. It's kind of
that's
important,
good.
Of course. Willis, didn't this Alvin Booty own a lot of land in northern part of the city?
Yes, he did. They were one of the very early. He was. There were two families of Booties. This was the early Booty family, and there was another family that came here in the 1920s.
But they weren't related.
No, there was no relation that we can figure. But he had quite a large holding of property north on 2nd Street. Yeah.
And he had either a brother or another that was here with him for some time.
Could be. I don't recall that.
All that land, I think the railroad ended up getting some of it.
Yes, could be. Yeah.
And this is another stone, of course, that's been overturned.
Yeah.
By bad weather or misbehaving children. I'm not sure which. But that's it for Alvin. David Fulton was one of the sons. I've forgotten the father's name now, but they were mercantile people who had big holdings, a big store down on the end of Cooley Road in the 1850s. And David, who's buried here, was a major during the Civil War of the 1st Wisconsin Heavy Artillery, and they were stationed in Washington, D.C. most of the war.
And of course, David built the house up on 6th and Orange. It's one of the great Victorian homes we have in Hudson. It's been fully restored now, and it was a very wonderful place, and it's one of the show spots of our community. And they were very successful people. I remember there's a piece in the paper when David Fulton died. The editor was wondering, he said, the estate has been probated, and it was learned that David Fulton had less than $100,000. Of course, you multiply that with today's prices.
So he
wasn't exactly a poor man.
No. Well, this store lasted a long time.
Oh yes.
It was down where the South Pier, where the boats came in, and he had first shot at all the boats that came in carrying goods. So it was a very successful outfit.
And the Esther Haven Fonseca's mother was a Fulton. Esther Haven Fonseca was a novelist from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and she wrote several books about. One of the books was had a Hudson background. It was 12 beds in a ballroom, and the other was Death Below the Dam. That was written in 1934, and it portrayed a mystery in 1934 when we had a flood on the Willow River and the dam broke, and that's how that got its name, of course.
That's what makes the book good.
Yeah. Did you ever read it?
Yes, I did. I struggled with it, but I did read it, yes. And I think I maybe have a copy if you really want it.
The library, it was in the Hudson Public Library, but somebody had filched it.
That's me. They gave it away. No, listen, not the truth. That's all the truth. They gave, the ones that didn't go out for years, they gave them away.
Well, anyway,
I was one time they're giving it away, and I got it. So
I saw that one got back in the library.
Well, maybe I'll bring it
because a man we were looking for books like that, and he said, "Well, give it to the library." So they have one back.
Well, I thought it was bad until I read it and realized it was all about Hudson.
So that's right. It's just an interesting book. Yeah.
Well, I'll bring that back. They can have.
Yes, you do that.
Okay, sorry, guys.
Well, Milton Nobles was one of the very early pioneers, coming in I think even the days before the territory.
Early 1840, May of 48, I think.
Yeah, well, and he came even before that. He was a member of the first county board, Milton Nobles. He and his brother came here, and these are his two children. And as I think that this stone is probably the oldest stone in the cemetery. The others have disappeared over the years.
Or broken down.
Or broken down, yes.
Well, we know what the next one will be, broken down.
Yeah, yeah,
Ah, shoot.
yeah.
They left here.
They left here and they went to Stillwater up the river.
Yeah. To do logging.
Yeah. This stone is the oldest one, I believe. It's dating 1851, and it's of Adelaide Young, and she was the daughter of Hannah Parrott, and Hannah Parrott was the early pioneer midwife in Hudson. And this is Jefferson. Yes. There's another. That's 1854.
Is that part of Jefferson Day House?
I don't know.
I remember that being
I can't see.
The banker.
I should have brought my. Yeah.
Well, this family, she was midwife the Parrott. How do you say that? Perot?
They called it Parrott.
They lived down at the end of Locust Street?
Well, they may have, yes. Yeah.
By the ferry? I bet they did.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know that. I really never thought who that was.
Yeah, that's right. That's who it is, yes. At the time.
Well, that's good. I think we solved a problem.
Yeah, yeah. This is T.E. Williams, Thompson Emerson Williams. And he was the father of Dr. Boyd Williams and Essie Williams, who are laid here. And he had quite a career, but very successful. And he, incidentally,
like a hardware store.
He had a Pioneer hardware store. And he's one of the people that survived the Great Fire. It came out of it with
May
flying
19th,
colors
1866.
because he had enough money to build a stone building at the corner of Commercial and 2nd Street.
And that went down just 10, 15, 20 years ago. When the
Yes,
first
that's right.
was built.
Right.
It was stood there as a monument.
His Dr. Boyd T. Williams, of course, was a cancer doctor in Hudson. He was an MD. He was a graduate, I believe, of Rush Medical School in Chicago. He came back to the Twin Cities, but he left there. He was, I think, asked to leave because of his cancer. And he came to Hudson. He operated a sanatorium for many years up on the South 3rd Street.
He had a lot of peacocks up there. And Fred Kramer always told the story about the peacocks there that made a terrible squawking noise. That was to cover up the screaming of the patients who were taking his treatment.
His sister was Essie Williams. She was a very brilliant student, and she was one of the first women to appear before the Minnesota Supreme Court. And she handled many legal cases, but she was eventually disbarred. And she was a teacher of law at Mechanic Arts High School in St. Paul. And she was a real character.
And she had really there's still the big house up on 3rd Street. She had a house at the corner of 3rd and Walnut, I'm sorry. And when she died, she left it to her cats.
No, she didn't.
Wasn't it?
She left
tell the story then.
She left it to the Episcopal Church.
That's right.
But there were so many ifs and ands in the will, it was so complicated that it took many, many years to settle, and the estate was quite substantial. It was in excess of $200,000 when it started, but when the Episcopal Church got there, and with all the
legal fees,
it had shrunk to $100,000. So
that's a pretty good shrinkage.
Yes, that is.
Well, this man was involved in one of the hottest legal battles in this part of the country.
Do you remember, Richard, that they carried correspondence from the proceedings of the divorce in the Hudson Times carried full columns, 4 full columns.
It's great reading.
And many of the people, our most prominent people, went up to testify and say what a fine man he was.
And the other part of the town went up to testify what a fine woman she was. So it was too hot for Hudson, so they said they went up to Osceola.
It had been removed from the...
And it had to do with the accusation, or the cause for the divorce was that he was apparently having some involvement with his young daughter. And the divorce was granted.
It was a very delicate subject in those days.
Subject in 1875. One of the things that happened during the divorce was everybody was up in Osceola or wherever it was at the hearing, and their young son was staying in Hudson with some people, and during the time they were up there, the young son died, contracted the disease, ran to somebody's house and died, and so they not only lost the marriage, but the young son died.
Very.
So it's a sad story, and I don't make light of it at all. I didn't.
No, really.
But it was a terribly, terribly hot issue at that time. Well, I think we've done.
Yeah, that's that.
About all the service we can do to T.E. Williams. Sorry.
This is a Boucher marker. Boucher was one of the there were two founders of Hudson, Peter Boucher and Louis Massey. Peter Boucher was Louis Massey's brother-in-law, and this is Boucher's daughter Tresse, who died in 1852. The Boucher and Massey came to Hudson in the spring of 1840 and were regarded as the first residents of our community. They lived, to begin with, they lived down at the foot of St. Croix Street in Frenchtown. Boucher and Massey, of course, were both Frenchmen. They had been removed from Fort Snelling. They had been there earlier, and they came to Hudson after the treaty, wasn't it?
Well, they came out of the Red River settlement, and
well, they settled at Fort Snelling.
They settled at Fort Snelling in 1827.
But they were asked to leave there, and so they came to Hudson.
And they said they filed on the land. I mean, these were pretty canny guys, because the Indian Treaty of '37 really took place.
That's right.
Got involved in 1838 before it got signed, and the news got back here.
They were some of the biggest landowners in Hudson.
They were the biggest landowners
to
here.
begin with.
They had the property right away.
Yeah, they.
And if they could roll over right now and come up, and they
see this,
much of the town, and wish they hadn't sold it quite so cheaply.
That's right.
Peter Boucher lived. Later on, he got into some trouble with the law and murdered somebody up in northern Wisconsin, and I'm not sure where he's buried.
I don't know either. He died in 1875 somewhere.
Cemetery, maybe if he was.
No, I don't think he's buried here.
Attracting Asian beetles.
It's too bad.
It must be Miss Boucher.
Yeah.
He lived in the alley between right across the street from Dick's Bar on Walnut Street. He had a house in the alley, and that's where this woman would have lived.
Yeah.
And the house burned down 2 years after she died.
Right.
It's not too far from Bob DeBruzzi's house, if that's between 1st and 2nd Street. Richmond Day was a local businessman, owned a shop in Hudson, and married Jeanette Allen, who was the daughter of Ben Allen, who eventually became colonel of the 16th Wisconsin. She died in childbirth in 1856, and Ben Allen, by the way, was an attorney here, and also the founder of Pepin, Wisconsin. Richmond Day went on to a career in surveying. And in the late 1850s, he was in the Richmond, or what they called Richmond. And there was a big fight what the town was going to be called. And so he was the surveyor, and they named the town after him, after Richmond L. Day. So that's how Richmond, Wisconsin, got its name. And as I said, Colonel Allen, Jeanette's his first wife's father, went on to become a veteran of Shiloh and Corinth, was the colonel of the 16th Wisconsin, and eventually died. Was the founder of Pepin, and eventually died in Pepin the day after 4th of July, 1875, and is buried there, not too far from the river in Pepin, Wisconsin, north side. I mean, that's the story of R.L. Day.
There was the Goss.
We can't pass through the cemetery without looking at who would be Hudson's only Civil War veteran from the Confederate side. His name was Charles Rice, and he was with the 2nd Maryland Cavalry, which was during some of its time was really a partisan group. Was not really well organized, and I've had trouble finding record of him, but I know he was with them. He married a Douglas from Hudson. And he worked here. He was from Virginia, but he worked here before the war. Traveled out to fulfill his own dreams, and was with that unit. But he came back here after the war was over and married a Douglas girl. That's Douglas with 2 S's, and they lived on the upper end of 3rd Street, up the hill on 3rd Street. And her dad used to look out. He was the guy that signaled the breakup of the ice every year for the
Really?
for the boat coming up the stream. The boats would toot way down the stream by Catfish Bar, and he'd run down and tell everybody the boats are in for April this year. They're in, and so that's the story of this guy. They married and had several children, and then they left the area. I think went to Madison area, but I don't know anything more about him.
I don't know either.
So that takes care of our Civil War veteran from the South. We're at the grave of Jean Jefferson Penfield. Jean is a daughter of
Amos.
Jefferson, famous for a banker in town and famous for the Jefferson Day House. And Willis, tell us about Jean, will you please?
Well, Jean came here. She was married and lived in the West Coast. And at the last years of the 19th century, she moved back to Hudson. And she was the house mother at Galahad School in North Hudson. And her son, Wilder Graves Penfield, became probably the greatest brain surgeon in the world at the time when after he had founded the Montreal Clinic. I forget the name, but he was there for many years, and he was at time accorded the honor of being the greatest living Canadian at that time. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth to the Order of Merit, in which only 21 British subjects are allowed to be in this organization of the Order of Merit. It's a great, great distinction. And Walter Penfield was known all over the world for his research.
And this is his mother.
This is his mother.
And she was a housekeeper.
She was the housekeeper at Galahad School
on the lake in North Hudson.
A school for boys in North Hudson, which thrived from about 1907 to about 1917. When it closed the war, because the teachers all went away to World War I.
Now Amos Jefferson, her
father
was a banker in town. I think First National Bank.
He was the president of the First National Bank, and he followed John Comstock,
yes,
who was the founder of the bank.
And there is now a bed and breakfast in Hudson called the Jefferson Day House.
And this is where Jean Penfield lived too.
Jean Penfield lived here too. So.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that's kind of a famous family in Hudson.
Yes.
That became more famous internationally.
That's right.
And let's wander over here to the Page. I think Page is
right over there.
Right over here, isn't it? John Page worked for the Mormons at Nauvoo, and he was busy up here in the 1840s cutting wood for this fast-growing Mormon community in Illinois. And then the high chief of the Mormon Church got knocked over, Joseph Smith, and the Mormons all left. Page, I don't think, was a Mormon, but he worked for them. He cut logs for them up here, and he was born in Maine. Was reported to be a sea captain. Well, he sailed his own ship.
Of course, he was a steamboat man here too, you know.
Yes.
And
a logger here primarily.
They were some of the original people. They came in between 1845 and 1847. And his daughter, Abigail Page Bailey, was the first white child born in Hudson on the day the first steamboat came into Hudson.
Palmyra.
The Palmyra. Yeah. And that was in April 15th, 1848.
Yep. And he lived, he logged, did some steamboating, I think some rafting, ran raft boats, and riding his horse down 3rd Street by Orange Street, he had a stroke and died. He was a great big man, about 6'5", and he cut off the back of his carriage and sat down on the ground and died by the courthouse.
And you know, it's interesting too that he has connections with Cyrus Snell.
Yes, he does.
Silas Snell. Silas Snell was on Captain Page's steamboat, and Snell remarks that, wouldn't it be a nice thing if I could be buried in that high promontory, which is now Liberty Hill for us. And Page said, well, if you do die here, I'll bury you here. Well, never thinking that those words turned out that he had to fulfill his promise. Young Snell did die, and they had to bury him, and they had to cut their way up to Liberty Hill, and they dug the grave and buried Silas Snell there, who was reportedly one of the first two white people to be buried in this area at the time. And that was in 1847.
And that is not his original gravesite that's marked on there now.
It could be.
He must have been on the other side of the hill because he dug it out.
Well, anyway, the marker was placed there by the Women's Club in 1921.
And there was some question about his name at that time.
Yes, there always has. Whether the name was Snell or Schnell.
Snell, and also there's a first name difference too.
Yeah, it could be.
I found Solomon Snell at Nauvoo, owning land in Nauvoo.
It's very difficult to find his name on any of the early records other than that.
Yeah.
Of course, he didn't live here, so.
John Page, no, he died here. John Page was an interesting guy, he saw opportunity and he took it.
He did.
Got a lot of logs for the Mormons. And so much for John.
So much for John. The Clapp family is a very old family in Hudson, and there have been some very distinguished members of them. One of the Clapps was a representative in Congress from Minnesota. He was very distinguished. But they have many descendants in this area at the present time. But this is a well-preserved stone, one of the best in the cemetery.
I would guess his children would have been Judge Clapp, who was in Hudson, an attorney in Hudson. And he was a young officer in the 4th Wisconsin Cavalry and was killed at Port Hudson in May of 1863 during one of the charges on the last bastion of the South and on the Mississippi River. So his son was involved. I'm sure it's his son. And there were other Clapps who were in the area.
Yes.
You think he's related to Junior Clapp?
Yes, they are the same family.
They are.
Yes.
Junior is part of our amazing unsolved murders.
Right.
So on the town of Roberts a few years ago. And that kind of does the Clapps.
Yes. Okay. Is there anything else down the line?
I would stand here longer and talk about him, but I'm kidding. Well, let me take a minute to introduce, first of all, Otis Clymer, 1876 to 1926, and then let me take a moment to introduce Otis Clymer's biographer over here, Steve Anderson, local bookseller and history buff, and to tell us about Otis F. Clymer.
Well, the only reason I know anything at all about Otis is because Mike Miller, the caretaker of Willow River Cemetery, pointed him out to me and said he was a professional baseball player, and indeed he was. I looked him up in the Baseball Encyclopedia, the Bible of baseball records, and indeed he's there. He broke into the National League for the Pittsburgh Pirates as an outfielder in the 1905 season. He played with Pittsburgh until 1907 when he was traded to Washington in the American League and played with them through the 09 season. He went back down to the minor leagues and came back for a final year in the majors in 1913. In the minor leagues, he played for Minneapolis Millers, and that's how he got eventually over here to western Wisconsin as a car dealer. He died in an automobile accident on a bridge in downtown St. Paul in February of 1926 when he ran head-on into another vehicle, and his car was pushed through the guardrail, dropping 75 feet to the railroad tracks below. He died shortly after impact. The interesting thing about him was that he was considered to be quite an athlete, even though he had trouble with a leg, and hence the nickname of Gump Clymer in baseball. But while on the Pittsburgh team, he played with Hannes Wagner, who of course is still considered by many to be the greatest shortstop in the history of baseball. And when he was traded, he went to the Washington team in the American League, where his teammate was none other than Walter Johnson, who is the
Big
the big train, the second winningest pitcher in the history of baseball with 417 lifetime wins. So Otis Clymer, buried here in Willow River Cemetery in Hudson, played with two of the greatest baseball players in the history of the game. Both Wagner and Johnson were in the group that was the first inductees into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1936.
And corollary to that, and 150 years before, his predecessor, and I've forgotten, John Clymer, was it, that signed the Declaration of Independence, and is famous. So this family has some fame going back to pre-Revolutionary War times, and there's more than one of them buried here. So his son, his family is all here.
All right. This is the final resting place of the legendary Charles Allen Ward and his wife, Yvette Henning Ward. Yvette was buried here earlier this year. She died in Arizona at the age of 93. Mr. Ward died in 1959. He was president of Brown and Bigelow for many years. He made Brown and Bigelow a worldwide institution. He lived in Hudson for a number of years, maybe 20 years. He was known for his great philanthropy and his flamboyant style. He did everything with the way of a Renaissance prince. He did everything well that way. He was very generous. He gave more money away than he left, but he left plenty of that. And they still talk about Charlie Ward, and everyone has a story about him. He was a tall, robust man, and with a lot of personality. He could be gentle, but he could be tough, and he was. He was a great contributor to every cause that had some goodness to it. I have a lot of respect for Mr. Ward and what he did for our community.
Go ahead. Willis, when was this chapel built?
Well, the chapel was built in 1921. It was built by Mrs. Thomas Humbird for the Cemetery Association, and it's used on, especially in the wintertime, for funeral burials and committals, that type of thing. But it was a memorial she left. The Humbird family, of course, were a very distinguished family in Hudson, and extremely wealthy, and mostly from the lumber industry.
Go ahead.
Another one of Hudson's famous people would be the Anderson family. And Willis, talk to me about H.J. Anderson and his family, will you please?
All right. Hans J. Anderson came from Denmark at an early age, and he settled in Minnesota. And he came to Hudson in the early or the closing years of the 19th century. And he was in the window business, and he was a contractor, and he made the wise decision to standardize the size of windows, and that, of course, established the Anderson fortune. And he had a very successful business here, but they moved to Stillwater.
Did he live on the southeast corner?
He lived on
Vine and
well,
7th. He built that house?
yes, he built the house there in about 1900.
Yeah.
And then after his death, his wife moved to 3rd Street to the old Fulton house.
Because he had a big factory in Hudson.
Oh, yes. And they moved lock, stock, and barrel to Stillwater, or to South Stillwater, which is now Bayport. But of course, today the Anderson are the greatest manufacturers of windows and patio doors in the world. They employ somewhere over 3,500 employees, and a name that is worldwide today. His son, or his daughter, and or his, no, they'll say his daughter. Yeah, that's right.
Or granddaughter.
Granddaughter.
I think.
His granddaughter is buried here too. Those stones we'll get. Is that all right? All right.
I worked at Anderson Corporation under his son,
Fred.
And Bob DeBruzzi and I were going to college at the time.
Is that so?
And Fred would come by we were in the moldering department, or tenanters, I can't remember, and at break time he'd make sure instead of taking a break with the rest of the guys for a cigarette, we all had to go to the study room and study. Fred was a great believer in education. And as a matter of fact, my great-grandparents came to this country on the same boat
Is that so?
as Fred Anderson.
It's interesting too about about H.J. Anderson. He died in 1914 in December. He had been downtown. He went downtown to sign with his attorney for the Anderson, turned out to be their profit sharing contract. On the way back, he dropped dead on the street.
That's been one of the great...
And he was one of the very first to have profit and sharing in the business.
We could use a few more of those today.
Yes.
Wonderful people. Really, really great people.
All right.
Well, the second of our two crypts is the Glover crypt in the new part of the cemetery. And this is kind of the way the old Crow crypt used to look. Willis, talk about Mr. Glover and his...
John E. Glover was a man of tremendous wealth in St. Croix County. He was in the lumber business. He was in real estate. He was in any number of things. He's buried here. And he lived in Hudson, for some years in the last of the 19th century. His home was on 3rd and St. Croix Street in Hudson. He's buried here. And at the time he built this vault, it was a tremendous expense. And it was said that it was one of the most expensive one in the area. It cost $3,000. You probably couldn't build it for $30,000 today, if that.
And if you put a kitchen in it, it'd be a lot more expensive.
Yes, that's right. It has room, I'm sure, for 12 bodies in here. Yeah.
I wonder how many are buried here. Do you think it's filled?
I think it is now, just about.
We've been told there's a bottle of champagne in there.
Oh, well, that's nice.
I just wondered if we should know more about it.
Yeah.
I know. Well, thank you very much.
Yes,
That's the Glover.
Yeah, that's it.
Site that's totally neglected by this town because of the absence of funds. It's a historic cemetery rather than an active cemetery, although there are, if you have family connections, you can still get in here, but there's not much space left because there's over 800 people buried here. And gosh, Willis, how long ago was it that they opened up the new cemetery across the street?
Well, that's a long time ago.
That's 100 and some years ago.
When was the last burial here then?
Well, there's still
Well,
stuff.
it all went up there in 1986.
1986. So if it's a family tie-in, you could still get in here. What's happened is that Willis thinks 20% of the tombstones are missing. I suspect that it might even be greater than that. And through the years, they get destroyed, they get knocked over, they get buried, they get thrown down the hillside. Everything happens to them.
Willis, why don't you were telling us just a minute ago when the first person was buried here and how that came?
Keep coming, keep coming, keep coming.
Tell us about that.
Well, the tract was given to the city in 1849 by Emma Andrews, who came here in the days of the territory, I think in 1847. And he's buried there, right on. But his wife's was the first burial here, and that stone in 1850 has since disappeared. And of quite recent, within the past 10 years, that's gone.
The thing about cemeteries that's changing, that makes this site more important. First of all, it is a cemetery. It's a historic cemetery. It's where the town's history lies, literally, with the town founders and the early pioneers, early businessmen and leaders. So it has the function of a cemetery, but it also has an historic function in that genealogists are interested in cemeteries, and so there's more attention being paid to cemeteries by those folks who are doing research. And there's also an increased interest now in cemetery art and design. There's always been an interest in epitaphs, what's written on a tombstone, but there's now an interest in the design of the stones and their cultural implications or representations of that period in social history. So that we have a cemetery that's historic to this community, but it has increased importance because of society's changing intellectual view on the role of cemeteries and what's here. But unfortunately, this cemetery has been badly neglected and vandalized. One of the things, well, there's a list of things that could be done, and that's what we're interested in making known to people. And if we can solicit help in the form of labor or funds or both from anybody, that's what's kind of behind all this. A year ago, the St. Croix Valley Civil War Roundtable, of which I'm a member, and Dick Larsen, that some of you know is a member, came up here and spent a day cleaning and raking and trimming, and we put together 7 truckloads of junk right out of this area that was hauled away. The city, as my understanding, maintains the grounds in so much as they mow the grass, and that's it. It's not their property. The Cemetery Association doesn't have any funds, so they can't do anything. And it's constant vandalism up here. And Willis, who did this article, or did his booklet on the cemetery years ago, reprinted in it an article about the vandalism that occurred in this cemetery. That article ran in the Hudson paper in April of 1895, over 100 years ago, talking about repeated acts of vandalism in this cemetery. And it is going on this year, 1995. They're still doing it. So what we need in the long run is a more secure perimeter around here. We'd like to get lights that are timed to come on at dusk, or at least, by midnight or something like that. We need to have some more regular maintenance done, and one of these things is a volunteer thing. The stones can be preserved if they're washed periodically in a solution that removes the mold and fungus that grows on these things. The mold and fungus that's on a number of the stones causes the stone to erode more rapidly, and we lose the inscription. But if we get up here and just gradually, periodically, with some volunteers, wash these stones off, we'll help save the inscriptions that are on them by removing that mold and fungus that eats away or helps the stone deteriorate more rapidly. There are other things that can be done, but primarily activity up here would help prevent some of the vandalism, and making it known to the community would also make it a little bit more important to people be a little bit more aware. Perhaps the vandals would be a little less likely to target this place. So things like that help get the community aware of it, also put it on the map historically, and we'll have more visitors coming to this. Ultimately, this could be as historic a site as any in the St. Croix County, as the Octagon House. People coming here because it's a beautiful setting, it's a historic spot, but with the increased interest in cemetery art and what it represents, there's going to be more people coming, as well as the genealogists that are doing their research.
Let's walk around and look at a few of the grave sites and see some of the damage that's occurred up here.
Yeah. 10 years before the Civil War, and he was a great property holder here, and much of the property around Lake Malaloo, and that area on 2nd Street on Lake Malaloo is his. 1858 is quite a long time ago, isn't it?
And that stone's been knocked over.
And this is the Fulton stone. You know, the Hughes house? The Hughes house, Helen Hughes' house? Well, that belonged to David C. Fulton, and he's buried here.
Well, supposedly there's a Revolutionary War veteran buried here.
There's no revolution.
Okay.
The War of 1812, the stone has since disappeared within the last 5 years.
It was here that recent?
Yes.
Well, we also have a supposed Confederate Civil War veteran.
Yes,
buried.
I don't know where that is.
It's over that direction. He was in the 2nd Maryland, but we've been unable to locate him on a roster of that unit, which is not unusual by itself, but it's unusual to have a Confederate veteran buried in Hudson, Wisconsin.
This is the man that built Helen Hughes' house. It's being restored, you know. David C. Fulton, who died in 1899. His father came here in 1858. They were very wealthy. The paper reported that when he died, they were very upset that he didn't leave more money. They thought he was wealthier than he was.
Well, we have another Confederate connection too. We have a Semmes buried here.
Yes, William Semmes.
He was a cousin of Raphael Semmes, who became the leading admiral of the Confederate States Navy during the Civil War. However, this Sims died prior to the war.
He's an attorney.
And buried here in Hudson. And so another Civil War Confederate side connection. We've got any number of Union veterans from the Civil War buried here.
Mostly over in the old, from the new cemetery.
Let's walk over there.
You see the house up here? That's Dr. Boyd Williams.
Well,
Have you ever heard of Dr. Williams?
it's further on, but there's a lot.
You know where Ruth Tiff lives?
Yes.
That's
Probably over
her stepfather.
Deliberately.
That was done
Tiff
deliberately.
did this. This is Sam's here.
Oh, Dennis.
Attorney at law.
Born, died in Hudson, September 13th, 1854.
Oh my goodness.
It's a long time ago, isn't it?
Yeah. What is this thing?
Sacred.
Well, dedicate.
Dedicated, huh?
No, I think it's
It's
sacred.
sacred.
Sacred in the memory.
Sacred in
of
memory.
Sam.
Now this is, he was a Mexican War veteran.
Born in Mexico, huh? Or
No,
No, what? In Mexico. Could I have the book? I'll have it.
I don't know that what is this lines up. This may be the rest of it on the flip side. And this one.
I hate to move it together.
It's rework. There's a lot of stones that need repair and resetting, but this is something that has to be done at least on a semi-professional basis, I would assume, in order to ensure that the stones remain standing. With broken stones and fallen stones, I don't know that we should have just every citizen out here trying to lift them
And
up.
his
We're
son
going to
came
have some
here,
liability
Circuit
problems.
judge. Fulton there. That is James Montgomery Fulton. Excuse me.
Well, and the kids probably combined throw. Well, it looks like there's been stones thrown back.
Yeah, where was it?
Driveway up into the cemetery. Yeah, the stones are through.
Jeremiah Whaley. He was a very successful merchant. And it was tighter than bark on the tree.
Number of people buried in town over Larsen stone. This must be Washington.
Who died in 1854. And this stone has been there since 1854. And there's a modern one, and that's his mother. Now that stone is in very good condition.
Yeah.
On the other side, so you can't even read who's buried there.
Most historic in this cemetery. Mr. Kroll was a very successful merchant here for many years, and he's the one that built the Opera House in Hudson. And when I was a young boy, we used to come up and play here, and there was an iron grill on the door, and we could walk in, and we always used to come up here and play, and it was always kind of spooky, and we thought that was really the thing to do. But until recent times, it's been in very fine state of preservation, but the vandals here a year ago, of course, really raised hob with it. And that took some real work to do this. Think of it. And the building cost $1,000 when it was built in the...
And the city put this board here?
Yes, they did.
And the caskets are in stone?
Yes, they're
Stone
in the...
several
There are 6 of them. I know that 2 are occupied, but I don't know about the others. There was a hardware merchant down on Main Street, right near the First National Bank, the building that Gagnon's owned, stone building, that's where he had his hardware store. He built in 1865. But Boyd was a cancer specialist, and he grew up in Hudson. He went to high school here, came back, and he attracted people for the cure of cancer, of course, and it was questionable, very questionable.
It says here that he made mistakes, he suffered much, he served well and honorably all suffering humanity who sought his assistance.
Do you have any idea what the depression is that we're looking at here?
Well, you see, in those days, they didn't use burial vaults. All you had was a pine box. The coffin fitted into the pine, or into a rough box, as they would call it, and it was buried. And then, of course, after years, maybe 2 and 3 years, it'll sink. It'll collapse. Yeah. And they have to fill these in. Yeah. And that's why nowadays, when you're buried in a cemetery, you have to have a cement burial vault, so this doesn't happen.
Company D, 2nd Maryland Cavalry, Confederate States of America. But when Dick Larsen looked him up in the roster of the 2nd Maryland Cavalry, his name was not listed. But these rosters during Civil War time and most war times are not entirely accurate. And there are people that transferred in and out of units that got missed in the count for that roster when it was compiled.
Did Dick
So we don't
write
know
the
for sure.
archives at all?
I don't think he wrote the archives, but he did get a copy of the 2nd Maryland's roster, and his name was not in it.
Webb, born 1861, died 1880. So she was 19 years old. And the epitaph, of course, is, "Remember me as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Prepare for death and follow me." You can see it's a very beautiful stone, but this is weathered quite well.
Well, but here's
But there again,
example of
what
the
you're
fungus.
talking about, and this is what will destroy it eventually, won't it?
Isn't that pretty unusual? Something that elaborate for a 19-year-old person? Would that
Well,
he know
no,
that
that-
it was from a
The
real
sentimental
substantial
aspect
family,
kicks
or-
in, and you'll see some for children
Oh,
that'll just break your heart because they
I think
died in weeks or months or even a few years. And of course, the disease factor in those days. 100 years ago, it wouldn't be unusual for a family, a couple, to have 10 children, in part expecting half of them to die before reaching adulthood, sometimes even before reaching puberty, because of the
like
disease factor.
diphtheria especially. That was the killer.
So there are some infant stones around here too that'll just
We have
carry
several
out.
of those. I don't know. I can't point them out where they have a little lamb, and then the inscription. There is the Darling. You know where Judge O'Brien's house, the Darling O'Brien house on 3rd Street. This is their stone. The Darlings were merchants in town too. Guys, yeah, cool. Prospect Park, you see Silas Snell, they're in here. Yeah. All right. John. We're dying. That was probably his grandparents, or great-grandparents, perhaps. His great-grandparents. Deer ran into
Oh,
him.
we did. Where was he?